Hello, everyone. Welcome. So again, we'll just be waiting another couple minutes for people to join the webinar here, and then we will get started with introductions. So hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Claire, and I am a programmer with the Waterloo Public Library. And I'd like to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn this morning. And this Lunch and Learn is for Islamic Heritage Month. So this month with Waterloo Public Library, as well as some of the libraries, I think, in the region, and at Kitchener Public Library, with the Coalition of Muslim Women, we will be celebrating Islamic Heritage Month. But today, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements, and their contributions to our community. The Waterloo Public Library is currently situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. We offer this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. Also, to let you know, we will be recording this event. So if you need to leave early, or if you know someone who might be interested in this as well, we will be recording it and sharing it on our YouTube page later on, so you can come back and watch it again. If you have any questions during the presentation as well, we're going to have some time at the end for a question and answer period. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's 2 little kind of speech bubbles, and it says Q&A below, and in there you can pop your questions and pose your questions, and then we will try and get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I'm now going to pass things on to my partner from the Coalition of Muslim Women, Mifra Abid, who will introduce our speaker today. Mifra is the coordinator of Together Against Islamophobia at the Coalition of Muslim Women and has been integral in putting this event and many of our other events together to celebrate Islamic Heritage Month. So Mifra, take it away.
Thank you, Claire, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome, Hassam. It's always great to have you here. I think it's becoming like a yearly tradition now, because we had him last year as well. So without much further ado, Hassam is actually a fellow and communication manager with the Yaqeen Institute. He's also currently pursuing an MA in Mediterranean and Middle East history at the University of Toronto. He is the founder of iHistory, a public history project, and was recognized as an emerging historian at the 2017 Heritage Toronto Awards. He also has a broad experience in the fields of journalism and public relations, and that's a lot. I'm sure there's much more, but I just want to keep more time for Hassam to talk, so that I'll stop here and just pass it on to Hassam.
Thank you, Mifra and Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today again, and to be launching, at least from my end, Islamic Heritage Month, Islamic History Month in terms of events with your community, this virtual community, as we gather together. And I will share my slides and get right into it, because we do have a lot of tasty history to cover, right, as we say. So just give me 1 second so I can get that going. Right. Okay, awesome. Food history and culture, and specifically Muslims' food history and cultures, is the theme for Islamic History Month in Canada this year. And the conversations that went into developing that theme really focused on coming out of the experience of the pandemic. We wanted to see, what the new normal looks like in terms of Islamic History Month, right? We've been talking about new normal in many different contexts. Is there anything that has changed through this very difficult and thought-provoking experience of the pandemic that we've had for a couple of years? And so we wanted to select a topic, and I was involved in that process of actually selecting the theme, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. But we wanted to select a theme that was very tangible. It was very participatory. It was easy to get everybody excited and involved around it, because we all have a relationship with food, right? And we all have an appreciation for food, I'm sure, and we'll build on that appreciation as we learn more about foods this month and food cultures this month, and hopefully throughout our lives as we eat and we enjoy food, we also think about it more deeply and appreciate its role in our lives, and also all of the natural and human processes that go into making food available for us, and hopefully that helps us increase in gratitude as well. And the other thing was that we wanted to get a very grounded angle on world history, right? The reason for that being, when we usually talk about history, we are talking about, kings and empires and wars and, these grand narratives of history, like impressive buildings that we all want to go visit and see, and, achievements in art and science. But an aspect of life like food, although we all kind of understand that it's always there, right? It's always in the background as people do things, as people do exciting things and achieve things, or they go through difficult things. Food is somehow involved in the background. They're eating or they're not able to eat, etc. Right? But it's like, when you watch a movie, and in movies, especially in maps, or when you use Google Maps, for example, right? When you look at the map as a whole, or in movies, when they're, especially like, I don't know, space movies or things like that, or disaster movies, right? When they're trying to isolate a variable, right? They're looking at this very chaotic situation, and somebody says, hey, can you focus on that particular variable, right? Can you focus on that particular factor? Can you get rid of all the layers on Google Maps and just show me one particular layer so I can get a different kind of insight? So this is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to peel away at some of the layers of history that we're used to and get to something that's very grounded and very relatable. It's like, let's isolate the factor of human life that is food, and see what new insights we can learn from Muslim culture, in particular in Islamic Heritage Month. But of course, there are many heritage months, there are many history months, and hopefully this is a recurring theme and a recurring sort of moment of education for all of the different cultures that, especially in Canada, we're blessed to enjoy food. I think, we have such a variety of options. I live in Toronto, I'm very grateful for that. Like, we have such a variety of foods that we can enjoy. I think we have a unique opportunity as Canadians to take advantage of that and learn about each other's culture through that particular factor of food. So I want to talk about some of the food culture before we get into histories of food itself, right? And so this is what you see here, some of the food culture of the Muslims. Sorry, it's been like 2 years and I still can't figure out how to get rid of this thing. Okay, there we go. I don't know if you guys can see what I'm talking about, but it's a Zoom thing. So a summary of Islamic eating etiquette, right? And this is something that has been developed and discussed for the 14 centuries in which Islam has existed as a religious tradition in many different parts of the world. And again, getting to the very day-to-day aspects of life and how we organize our lives around religious teachings, especially around food. So one of the famous sort of people in Islamic history, a sort of pious figure, somebody who was known for his refinement of his habits and his etiquettes and things like that. His name was Hassan al-Basri. So he was from the city of Basra in Iraq, modern day Iraq. And he lived in the 7th century and the early 8th century. And so he kind of provided this summary, right, that for him, encapsulates the most important Islamic etiquette teachings related to food. So I just want to go through them quickly, just so when you are having your meals, whether you're Muslim or you're not Muslim, when you're having meals in Muslim eating establishments, or when you're sharing meals with Muslim friends or family, whatever the case might be, you can sort of be mindful of these things and also understand some things that may not be as familiar to you. So he divides this list up into 12 main points, right? And he says 4 of them are an obligation from Allah. So these are the most important, the priority. Like, these are obligations for the person, for the human being who is consuming food from God, which is to invoke the name of Allah before eating. So we say something called Bismillah, which means in the name of Allah in Arabic, before we eat, a very short prayer, and it comes in different forms, but that's the basic one. To know which food is forbidden. So haram is a word that you may have heard, and conversely halal, right? Halal meaning permitted food, similar to how in the Jewish tradition there is kosher food. Muslims have halal food, which means it has not only is it not in the category of certain foods that are completely forbidden for Muslims, such as pork, for example, or anything containing alcohol, but also animal, particularly meat products that, of course, that have not been slaughtered in a, following the rituals established in the Islamic tradition. So if it is slaughtered, that meat is slaughtered, and the byproducts of the animal byproducts in any food, if they're coming from animals that have been slaughtered following the ritual approach, we call that halal food or halal meat or halal byproducts, halal ingredients in different foods. And if it's not, then we call it haram, then it is forbidden. The third one is to take pleasure in it, so to actually enjoy it. And the fourth is to thank Allah for it, to be grateful for it. And you'll notice like a recurring theme here is to have gratefulness in different forms, to be grateful for the food in different forms. And another recurring theme, which we'll get to it right now, is eating very consciously, very mindfully, in very limited quantities, especially, right? So if we move on now, the four customs of Prophet Muhammad, who is the role model for all Muslims, to sit on one's left foot while eating. Now that sounds a bit weird, right? But in that, again, the classical Muslim tradition, we eat on something called the sofra, which is not a table, it's just a cloth that is spread across the floor, or a sort of mat that's spread across the floor, and then we sit around it and we eat together. So we're sitting on the floor, and this is basically, when you are sort of in a crouching position, I guess you would say, like you are sitting on your left foot while eating. And it's another way, the implication is to limit your consumption by not getting too comfortable when you are sitting, around a meal, to not reach across the table or the spread. So to not reach across and be sort of, basically meaning start with the food closest to you. So whatever's closest to you, right? In another way, don't be picky, right? Don't reach across for something if it's across the table, and you might really like it, right? If it's like, I don't know, fried chicken or something really good that you want, don't reach across for it. Start with the food that's closest to you, and then you can get to the food as the food gradually gets passed around the spread or the table. To eat with 3 fingers, again, that seems kind of weird. Utensils, of course, in the time of Prophet Muhammad were not readily available. Today they are, but in many Muslim cultures and in many cultures in general around the world, people do still eat with 3 fingers. With their fingers, with their hands. And again, specifically with 3 fingers, again, implying small morsels, small amounts. Don't grab too much. Don't have your entire hand full of food. Don't be stuffing your mouth. Eat a small amount at a time. And you can see this recurs in some of the other teachings here. The gratitude, again, not wasting any food. Lick your fingers when you're finished, right? So again, running water was not something that was readily available. So one way to actually clean your hands relatively, apart from various things that they could be wiped on, is licking the fingers. And that has the additional benefit in this Islamic perspective that you are not wasting any food at all. If there's any food left on your hands after you eat with your hands, you kind of make sure you clean them that way. And then Al-Hasan al-Basri, he says there are 4 things that are sort of not prescribed by Allah or the Prophet, but they are good manners in general. You should wash your hands always. You should try to wash your hands before and after eating. You should take small bites. Again, you should chew thoroughly, and don't stare at friends. Now, this last one is very interesting, which is that don't stare at people when they are eating, right? And this is something that is so stringent in many cultures in Islamic history. It's almost funny to read about how much of a strictness there is about this in particular. And what this led to in early sort of Islamic culture was the rise, of course, of party crashing, right? So people would throw these big parties, and there wouldn't always be like a security guard. There's no Eventbrite, there's no ticketing system, etc. There's no sign up, right? So everybody would show up, and there was an entire sort of class of people that would be known as tufailis, right? Tufailis meaning people who would basically crash parties all the time, crash wedding banquets all the time. And the reason it couldn't be regulated is because of this strict measure against staring at friends. So if somebody is eating, if somebody that you are eating with, right, or somebody's eating nearby you, you should not stare at them and you should not. So anytime anybody would complain at one of these parties, it's like, hey, who invited you, right? That person could sort of counter complain and be like, wow, did you, like, they would show up at food time, so they can't be confronted, right? And then it'd be like, wow, did you just stare at me while I was eating, kind of thing. So this is a very interesting, peculiar kind of thing in many Muslim cultures in history. And there's sort of like a deeper implication to that as well, as some people might eat less, some people might eat more, people might eat different things they're not familiar with, people might have different ways of eating, etc. And even, you know, thinking about such things as eating disorders and people who may have a different kind of relationship with food. It's like, you know, when you are eating food, it's good to share, it's good to have that you know, a spirit of sharing, but also mind your business basically, and mind other people's privacy as they do this very intimate action. Eating is in a way very intimate, right? Some other teachings that we come across in the Islamic tradition as Muslim scholars discussed, again, in this category of refining character: buy local, so buy local produce, right? There's various different incidents and anecdotes that are related to teach Muslims this. And basically in our times, the way we would say it is like, go to your local grocery store as opposed to maybe Costco, right? Even though you might get a better deal or something like that, but this is part of, in the Arabic language, it's called Husn al-Jiwar, which means perfecting your neighborliness. So buying local, and it's interesting, you know, such concepts, for example, as now we have the 100-mile diet today, right? Which is like this diet, which is very interesting, which encourages people to try to consume only food that has been produced within 100 miles of where they live, right? And how does that sort of shape their relationship with food, what kind of access to different foods that they have, and what kind of health benefits come out of that. Another point is eat with the disadvantaged, and we have many sort of anecdotes of Prophet Muhammad and people of sort of known for their piety and scholars and people that Muslims look up to as role models of eating with the disadvantaged, and such people, again, as for example, people who had leprosy, who were shunned in many societies historically, but the Prophet Muhammad made a point to share from the same plate with a person who was living with leprosy, to kind of teach a lesson that, again, you know, how can we apply this to situations of eating disorders or people who may have a more difficult kind of relationship with food or with eating, etc., and encouraging them in ways that are non-intrusive, but at the same time they are supportive of eating the way that they are comfortable with, and gradually trying to overcome the challenges that they face. Ghazali, who is a famous person in Islamic history, very famous, prominent scholar in Islamic history, he says, basically, you know, he kind of sums up the whole thing. He says, don't do anything which others hold to be unclean. So cleanliness is a priority here. So just read the room, read the situation. What kind of culture do you live in? What kind of society do you live in? What kind of people are you with? And how are you going to, you know, have the best sort of approach to eating in that particular environment that you are eating in? So if people are not used to something, if they are, have certain standards of cleanliness and eating etiquette in the local sort of immediate situation that you're in, just go along with that. And one of his my favorite quotes actually is "no double dipping," right? Which is also from Ghazali. So he's going very granularly into this guidance that he's offering to Muslims, and his books are still available and they've been translated into English, right? So he says if you are eating a broth, or if you're using some kind of vinegar and you're dipping some kind of bread or something into it, and you cut that piece with your teeth, right? You bit into it, then don't immerse it back into the broth or the vinegar. So, interesting way of just saying no double dipping. So, and this is just to give you a sense of the richness of this tradition, and there's a lot of writing in the English language as well for those that are interested, that is available around this. And again, this is part of even religious traditions that we often might ignore, right? But the Jewish tradition has a very rich kind of heritage of teachings related to food, and so does Buddhism and Hinduism and all of the different religions. So it's something to pay attention to when we look at any particular sort of religious tradition. Okay. Now, another thing I want to go into very quickly, which is not really the topic, within the confines of our topic here, but I pin this to the top, is something known as the Islamic Agricultural Revolution. So the early Muslim empire, which you can see mapped out there, which is the empire that emerged within about a century of the life of Prophet Muhammad after he had passed away, was the largest land empire seen in the world up until that point in history. Of course, later on, there were larger empires, but it established something called the Pax Islamica, the Islamic peace, or the Muslim peace. And of course, not everything was peaceful. So the idea of saying that is basically that it was a unifying factor, and all of these distant places were unified in ways that they had never been in before. So you can see basically the capital of this massive empire was in Damascus in Syria, and you can see that it has kind of a foothold in the Indian subcontinent, and in Central Asia, and in Spain, and in North Africa, and in East Africa, and of course the Arabian Peninsula itself. And also it's coming to a situation where Muslims are culturally and politically influential in two very important, maritime trading routes in the Indian Ocean as well as the Mediterranean Sea, right? Because they control so many of the ports, and they're sort of predominant in that region. So this is going to make a movement develop of food moving and ingredients moving and fruits and vegetables moving, as well as agricultural technologies moving from east to west, right? Particularly from the Indian and Persian civilizations, which were now Islamified, moving westward across the other Muslim lands. And so you can see a list of sort of some of the crops and other things, right? Cotton and musk and things as well, that were part of this movement, and especially irrigation systems and irrigation technology, and making areas, particularly in the Middle East, much of which is desert, right, and too dry, but making those areas sort of able to support crops that were not previously supported in those regions. And so this is going to be the distribution across the Mediterranean, and of course into Europe, and then from Europe, as we'll discuss, into the Americas, of many of these foods, especially wheat and sugar cane and citrus fruits, banana, coconut, watermelon, mango, right? Spinach. It's all going to go through this movement that's facilitated by what has now become known among historians as the Islamic Agricultural Revolution. Another sort of few points quickly to keep in mind is that the largest rebellion in Islamic history also came in the context of agriculture. You can see the years there, in southern Iraq, right? In the marshes of southern Iraq. It's known as the Zanj Rebellion, right? And so this again draws our attention to the various movements and challenges that are in the food justice space today, right? We remember the farmers' protests in India, for example, a couple of years ago, as well as the rights of undocumented migrant farmers in Canada and in the United States, right? And all of these things are things that we should also be paying attention to, that historically so much of the sort of political upheaval and social change has been driven by the need for food and the processes of food production, right? And so whenever we find these crises and things as they happen, again, it's interesting to isolate the food angle and pay attention to it from that standpoint, and see if there's any insights we can learn that we might otherwise have missed. And then finally, cookbooks, food as medicine, and Ziryab's legacy. So 3 random points, right? Cookbooks are available in the English language. They have been translated, many of them. So we have sort of Chinese Muslim context, right? Muslims in China and the cookbooks that they developed. The oldest cookbook in Chinese history was the oldest known cookbook in Chinese history was written by a Uyghur Muslim. Similarly from the classical Baghdad, basically the House of Wisdom and the 1001 Nights in that culture. We actually have an entire cookbook available from that time period and that culture. Similarly, from Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, there is a cookbook available, from that particular culture. And they're all available in English and translated and actually edited in a way that you can follow up on those recipes. So I'm happy to share those with you if anyone's interested. Another important thing to keep in mind is that food as medicine was the medicine, right? We didn't have synthetic lab technology for most of Muslim history. And, so food was the medicine. And that also leads to very, very interesting sort of recipes and things that were used to treat or at least alleviate or minimize some of the symptoms, some of the pain, some of the health related challenges that people, of course, suffered as humans have throughout history. So for me, for example, I am a type 1 diabetic since childhood. And for me, it's very interesting to see a famous physician like Ibn Sina, for example, using these extremely complex recipes, like foods that foods that sort of you prepare from herbs and other things, and they have to be eaten at a certain time, and they have to be sort of even when you're making the recipe, like there's a certain order that you have to follow very strictly, right? And sort of trying to squeeze out whatever health benefits they were perceived or they knew would come about from these recipes. And modern research shows that some of that was actually very effective in treating, for example, diabetes, and not treating it in the sense that because they had no idea really how diabetes worked, they were just trying to treat the symptoms, but it would have some kind of soothing effect, or it would give some relief to the person suffering from that particular condition in that time. So that's another very interesting angle, right? The sort of nowadays we differentiate between the restaurant and the pharmacy, and that differentiation has existed throughout history as well, but not as much as it is today. Whereas the food, the famous saying that let medicine be thy food and food be thy medicine was very true in Muslim history as well. And finally, this individual named Ziryab is an important person to keep in mind. He was from Iraq, from the region that's Iraq today. And he got into some political, tight situation, and he moved to Spain, to Al-Andalus, to Andalusia, which was also sort of culturally influenced by Muslims at the time. And he is basically credited with refining eating habits and etiquettes, again, above and beyond what we discussed earlier, which was something that was passed down generation to generation among Muslims everywhere they went. But he focused on specific things. So for example, the concept of a 3-course meal can be traced back to Ziryab in Al-Andalus. The sort of the idea of sort of the standard cutlery, right? Like the fork and the spoon and the knife can be traced back to Ziryab as well in Al-Andalus. And another thing is glass sort of goblets, right? So for much of history, sort of metal containers were considered the best sort of containers to drink out of, and he really popularized basically, like using a glass goblet, a glass as we would say today, as the main sort of thing that we should be using for drinking, right? So it's very interesting. He's like the social media influencer type of person of his day in southern Spain and Andalusia, presenting all of these ideas and first presenting them in the royal court and the circles of the elites. And once they took root there, then, they trickled down to the rest of society. And of course, Spain was very proximate to the rest of Europe, and anything that was happening in Spain quickly trickled into places like France and Italy and the UK, right? Or Britain as well. So Spain was that important site of exchange of ideas, food products and food ways. And then we get to the Columbian Exchange, which is a very important event in history, in human history. As the name suggests, after Christopher Columbus's voyages through which he, reached the Americas as we know them today, there was this exchange of not just people, of course. So we know about the transatlantic slave trade, and we know about the movement of some of the crops, and you can see many of the crops are the same ones that the Muslims had played a very significant role in moving from sort of the Indian subcontinent and the Persian zone into North Africa and into Spain. And now Columbus is launching himself from Spain, and sort of the Spanish are developing what they call New Spain, right? Which is the Caribbean and Mexico and the Americas that they had explored up until that time. And they're taking some of these foods with them, right? So again, the banana, the sugar cane, the citrus fruits, the olives, dates as well, right? Which we'll talk about in a second. But so you can see this transition continuing westward now across the Atlantic Ocean. But conversely, of course, they found a lot of new food products in the Americas that the indigenous people were enjoying, right? And they were cultivating, and they had sort of a rich food tradition and cuisine of their own. And I think it's something to pay attention to, as we reflect on truth and reconciliation. Again, what about the food angle, right? How is it that the civilizations that gave the world tomato, for example, something that's sort of a core ingredient in any kind of cuisine, basically anywhere in the world, is extremely expensive in Nunavut, right? Like they can't go to a grocery store. It's something they have to think twice about. Or, in some of the remote locations where these indigenous communities exist, what is being done to facilitate access to food, and not just any food, but specifically like, foods that they themselves have given to the world, right? And how difficult is it now for them to access those same foods and enjoy them? So that's something, again, as we talk about food justice, and it's an angle that we can sort of keep in mind. But you can see there, many of the foods were taken back to Europe. And again, they found a market first, many of them, before they became popular in Europe, right? They found a market actually in North Africa and in Asia, right? In what we call the Middle East. So, why is a turkey called a turkey, right? Because the turkey, of course, was found in the Americas, but then it was taken to Europe, where it initially did not have much success as a food, but where it did find success was in the Ottoman Empire, right? And that included Egypt, the Turks in Egypt, the Turks in what is now called Turkey, etc. And so that's how it came to be known as Turkey, right? Another interesting example is corn, right? So corn, again, does not take off. First cultivated, of course, thousands of years ago in the river valleys of Mexico, but it did not take off in Europe as quickly as it took off in sort of the Middle East. And you could theorize that that may be because historically, like European cultures were more isolated, like relatively isolated, as opposed to a place like the Middle East, which is literally the cradle of civilization. So the people there and the cultures that have developed there are naturally more familiar with the idea of new foods coming in. So as new foods came in over thousands and thousands of years, different civilizations and merchants bringing in food and different foods being developed, etc. They just have like this spirit of taking whatever new food is available and seeing what you can do with it, right? And so corn, it's interesting that, and with many of these fruits and many of these products, the point of exchange, as we'll talk about in the case of coffee as well, is the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, right? So in Mecca, there's this annual gathering every year of Muslims from around the world. And so they would gather there. And so whatever idea you could get to take off in the city of Mecca would quickly spread to different regions. So corn is coming from Mexico, and of course here in Ontario as well, and across North America as well, corn was cultivated. And it ends up in Mecca, and somebody picks it up from Mecca and takes it to the Indian subcontinent. And today, even to this day, I remember my grandmother when I was young and I would go to Pakistan, she would be sitting on like a stool and she would be making cornbread, right? It's like in the Pakistani or the North Indian style, it's like a roti, it's like a chapati, but it's made of corn, right? So that's our form of cornbread. But it was called makai, right? Which means it came from Mecca, right? So corn, of course, didn't originate in Mecca, but it shows you, and this is, by the way, not just among Muslims, the Hindus and the Sikhs and others who enjoy this cornbread across North India, they're all saying that this is something that came from Mecca. And that sort of serves to remind us of Mecca being this very crucial point of exchange, not just of ideas about science and art and other things from a human history perspective, but also of food as well, the spread of food to different regions around the world. I'm just going to go quickly through this slide because I want to get to like our core examples and also have time for the Q&A. But as the world then became more globalized, of course, there were more exchanges of food in different ways, right? So the Spanish, when they were establishing New Spain, they tried to bring a lot of that Andalusian Muslim culture that they had now inherited to New Spain with them. And one of those things that they tried to bring were the date palms, right? So they tried to bring date palms from Cuba, and the indigenous people, of course, because they were trying to defend their homes, they attacked the food or this food source, the date palm orchards that the Spanish established on the island of Cuba, and they destroyed them. And then the second time, the climate didn't prove very friendly and the heavy rains destroyed them. And then the experiment ended, but there's still a town in Cuba that's known as the Date to this day, right? Dates were later experimented with in California in the early 1900s, and they were successful. The experiment there was successful. So in South California, like I guess near the San Diego area, very close to the border, you can actually find sort of these sort of date orchards, the date palm orchards, and not very incidentally, it has like that whole place, that valley has its own particular culture. So you'll have towns called Mecca and Indio and basically very Eastern sounding names and sort of Muslim context names as well. Highlighting the interconnectivity again, this very interesting story of in Bosnia, right? So this is how foodways change over time. Plums basically used to be used in Bosnia before Muslims arrived and Bosnia began to convert to Islam in very large numbers. They used to be used to make sort of alcoholic drinks, right? Of course, once the Muslim cultural influence arrived, there wasn't as much demand for the alcohol. So Bosnians, they found other uses for their plums. And one of those uses was to make prunes. And their prunes became famous across the world. They would be exported to Brazil and they would be exported to the United States, etc. Now, their story is of a sudden drop in demand in 1863 for the farmers to, of course, panic about that, the Bosnian farmers. But what they didn't realize was how far their food was reaching. So they would trade it locally. And of course, these networks of trade were taking their prunes all the way to the United States, where they were usually in high demand. But because this American Civil War had started, the demand had dried up. So, right, again, giving us a sense of the interconnectivity. Another very interesting story is of Nestle and also Tobler, right? So Tobler was the chocolate manufacturer or chocolatier, right, from Europe, who was supplying chocolate to the Ottoman army. And that chocolate, of course, would become what we know today as the Toblerone. And so that's one angle of that. But also Nestle began to sell its first major product, the baby formula, in the Ottoman Empire in 1875. And they experimented with their international marketing strategy there. So Nestle said, of course, we are successful in certain contexts already, but if we really want to go international, what's a good place for us to experiment with our marketing strategy? And so they started with the Ottoman Empire. And if you can read sort of the Ottoman Turkish here in the original script in which it was written in this image, this is basically a newspaper advertisement basically saying that Nestle, so you can see if you can read the Arabic script, it says Nestle right here in quotation marks. It says Nestle is the best milk chocolate that there is. So these interesting exchanges happening. Another one of my favorite examples actually is of curry powder, right? So the first Canadian cookbook started to emerge in the mid 1800s, and one of the recurring ingredients within them is the curry powder. And of course, curry powder originates in India, specifically South India, right? That's where they have a sort of a dish that is made with fish and certain spices, and it's known as curry. And when the British went to India, they took that word curry and they applied it to basically anything that was using a particular mix of powder, the curry powder, and what we know as curry today very generically, right? But in Canada as well, then it was considered a crucial ingredient for the pioneers as they were settling in Ontario and Manitoba and in other places, that they needed curry powder to not only make the meat more tasty, but also as a preservative, right? So it was used as a preservative by the pioneers, and it was a very important ingredient mentioned like in early hunting manuals, hunters' guides, in the Canadian context in the mid-19th century, as well as in sort of the very first cookbooks that we have. Coffee. So we're going to talk about coffee, and then we're going to talk about shawarma, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. These are all pictures that I have taken on my phone within, I would say, the last 3 months without any planning, right? Without any like actually going out to search for them. So I took a trip to Ottawa, right? And I find this this Inuit coffee brand, and it's selling this very interesting coffee that is mixed with certain cultural Inuit cultural ingredients coming all the way from Nunavut. It says, as you can read, I'm not sure if you can, but it says made by the North for the North. And it says 100% Arabica copy in the Inuit language, right? Second photo is from a convention I went to, and a young Muslim couple had started this business where they are selling Habesha coffee. And if you know, Habesha refers to Abyssinia, it refers to Ethiopia, and that's where coffee is believed to have first originated from, right? So they are bringing that original Ethiopian coffee to now Canada and trying to promote it through this new small business that they've started. And this last one is at a Starbucks. It's just the wall sort of decoration at a Starbucks close to where I live. So I went to grab a coffee, and they have this massive display. It says Coffea Arabica, grows at higher elevations. It's harder to grow, so much better to drink. Less than 3% of the world's coffee is good enough for Starbucks. Okay, right? All of it is Arabica. So you see this word Arabica, the key word of being Arab, constantly coming up again and again within this particular context of coffee, as this is the prime coffee to drink. Of course, there's many other great coffees, but Arabica is considered sort of a standard. Canadians, as you might know, drink more coffee per capita than any other country in the world. Like we drink more coffee per person, right, than any other country in the world. And it's kind of crazy, but it's a part of our culture, right? So that's an interesting statistic that you can look up. Like, the from year over year, the statistics change about how many cups, etc. And it would be interesting to see how they measured that and also how that was affected with the pandemic. So that's something to sort of look into. But another thing that I think is more important to look into, at least from the standpoint that I'm coming from, is how we really reflect on the way that coffee has reached us. So the story is that in the 15th century, there was a shepherd in Ethiopia who was basically shepherding his flock, the sheep, right? And the sheep started to eat from the berries, right? What's called the coffee berry of a particular plant, and he noticed that they became very agitated after eating from that plant. So he tried the plant himself, right? The cherries himself, and then he became very agitated. And slowly, this is sort of like the legend of the beginning of coffee. There's some indication that coffee may have been known and consumed prior to that as well, but to be honest, those aren't very conclusive either. So this is why we kind of go with this story. Then what happens? It quickly crosses the Red Sea over to Yemen. And in Yemen, you have these Muslim monastic kind of, brotherhoods, you might call them, of people who basically stay up very late into the night engaged in collective worship, right? Islamic sort of traditions of worship. And once they found out about this drink that can kind of keep them awake and energized throughout the night, of course, they are ready for that, and they are sort of enjoying that. So in Yemen becomes the initial trading point, and would be for many centuries afterwards, for coffee, right? And so even the city in Yemen that's known as Mocha, for example, the city of Mocha gives us what we call the Mocha coffee, right? And many of these terms that we use and associate with coffee actually come from places in Yemen or other sort of aspects of Yemeni culture. Now, the interesting thing again is these debates that happen in Mecca, right? So here you can see Mecca, kind of an artistic illustration of it. And these scholarly debates about, is coffee halal or haram? Is it permitted or is it forbidden, right? And intense scholarly debates, and also keeping in mind not just the food, but of course, it wasn't intoxicating in a sense. It wasn't like it was an alcohol situation, but it did have certain social effects. So people drink coffee, now they're staying up later. So now that they're staying up later, well, what are they doing, right? Now that they have all of this agitation and energy, what are the social impacts of coffee? So this incredibly rich debate happens first in Mecca, later it will happen in Istanbul as well. But the interesting thing is, what we call Sharia here, right? So Sharia is a word that I'm sure many of us have heard before, but it's often misused in many different ways, right? As often mentioned only in contexts where apparently something that's being done is repressive, or things like that, and it's something that is regularly coming up in Islamophobia discourse. But those same Islamophobes are drinking coffee that has only reached Canada by way of the Sharia. And what we mean by that is that if coffee had been ultimately deemed impermissible, so first it was considered impermissible, right? It was considered haram temporarily, but that same mechanism, that same kind of rich tradition, what the Sharia actually is a rich tradition of knowledge and different methodologies to arrive at sort of legal judgments about anything related to Muslims. So that rich tradition had within it the capacity to then revisit that initial kind of reaction to coffee and its popularity and say, hey, there's actually nothing wrong with this drink, right? And so it was from Mecca again that coffee would spread then to all over the world, right? To all over the world, first Syria and then the Ottoman Empire, and then into Rome, where the Pope actually called it, so again, the Pope goes through a similar process in the Vatican. He says, first he calls it the devil's drink because it's coming from the Muslims, and Muslims and the Christians are often at odds, right? So first he calls it the devil's drink. But then he says, you know what, there's a lot of benefit in it. So even though it's the devil's drink, it's allowed, right? So again, they go through the similar process in the Vatican as well. And then gradually coffee spreads to different regions of the world, and the production of coffee also spreads to different regions in the world. But ultimately, like we can see at this original Tim Hortons cups, I don't know if they have these anymore. I noticed the cups are like kind of different now often when I get them, but it says 100% Arabica, right, from the Arabs at the bottom of the Tim Hortons cup as well, and how much of that is part of our culture. So a lot to say about coffee. I will be giving more detailed sort of presentations about it during this month. So stay tuned for those if you're interested in learning more, but just something to keep in mind. The final thing that we're going to talk about very quickly, although I'd love to spend a lot of time on this, is the family tree of basically the same food that everyone has made very minor adjustments to, right? So in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, so that's the 1500s, this tradition developed of stacking layers of meat on a horizontal skewer. So I don't know how clearly you can see this, but that's what's going on in the background here. There's a horizontal skewer. It kind of looks like a shawarma on a spit that we might be familiar with, right? I don't know if you can follow the cursor, but if you see in the back there, and this is known as the ja kebab, right? The ja kebab. Excuse me. Now, the ja kebab is of course very simple, usually made of lamb, right? That's usually what it would be, and some spices. And the idea was to have a rotating spit, so it would be evenly cooked, and then it could be cut into small pieces and put into a wrap, some kind of bread, and enjoyed that way. Sorry about that. So that's what started in the 1500s. The rest of the story is only about 170, 180 years old, right? So in about the 1830s, somebody in Turkey had the idea, what if we did a vertical spit, right? What if we started making this on a vertical spit? The idea being that more of the fat that was melting off of the meat as it cooked would be reabsorbed into more meat closer to the bottom, right? And that would make for a richer kind of taste. And the same thing would happen with the spices. You put them on top, right? Because horizontally, it's more spread out. Vertically, it's going to be more sort of constrained space-wise as it drips down. And there's going to be more time for it to drip off of the spit. So it will get soaked up into the meat itself. And then, of course, having it turning at the same time. And this became known, again, this starts in the 1830s, as the doner kebab. Now, doner just means rotating, right? The word in the Turkish language, it means sort of a rotating spit. And then this will turn into all of these different foods that we see here. So shawarma in the Arabic language is a word that comes again from the Turkish language. It also means rotating, something that's turning because the spit is rotating, so the meat cooks evenly. The shawarma inspires the Mexican, what is known as the tacos al pastor, which is of course made of pork, which shawarma is never made of. But again, the key idea was that it was more of a concept of cooking, a way of making the particular kebab, as opposed to like a strict kind of recipe. It was more a methodology than it was a recipe, right? And so it was customizable, and it was very good. It was tasty. It was nutritious, and so all of these cultures not only adopted it, but they also adapted it, right? So the Greeks, they came up with gyro, based on their experience with doner kebab. German doner is its own kind of thing, and there's slight variations in all of these things. And then there's Canadian doner, which is different from shawarma. And I remember going to Alberta. On a trip last summer, and I just see all these doner places everywhere. And sometimes I go inside them, and it's actually what I know as shawarma. And this is just a different linguistic kind of approach, because doner is something that is descended from the Greek gyro. So the Greeks brought this concept first before the Arabs to Canada, especially Atlantic Canada. The official food of the city of Halifax is Canadian doner, by the way, right? So especially in Atlantic Canada, it became very popular, and then it was taken from there, particularly to Alberta and to the prairie provinces. There's a funny saying that there's a town, High Prairie, right? So in High Prairie, Alberta, there's only 3 traffic lights, but there's 4 doner places, right? So this is a very small town in Alberta, but it only has 3 traffic lights and 4 doner places because of how popular doner is within that particular kind of community in High Prairie, Alberta. And so, I won't go into detail. You can kind of look it up because we don't have much time here. But you can kind of look up the differences and the slight variations. But basically, it's all the same concept and reminds us of, food can start a certain way, but then it can be developed into other kinds of foods as well that we can all share. And it's funny, if I go to Kensington Market, which is like the cultural hub of downtown Toronto where I live, within like 50 meters of each other, there is a Mexican tacos al pastor place, there is a Canadian doner place, and there is a shawarma place. And there's a German doner place, and they're all selling basically the same thing. And sometimes I wonder, I go there, I can stand in one spot, and from that spot, I can look at all 4 of those takeout places, or you can dine in, whatever, in Kensington Market. And I'm like, I wonder if people ever realize that they're all selling essentially the same thing, right? Just very, very slight variations that have been made in the different cultures. And so, we have the earliest known photo here in 1855. So this is from 1855. You can, of course, see the familiar shawarma setup. This is from the Ottoman Empire as well, that the spit had now become vertical. And I will wrap it up there. A lot more to say about all of these things. Thank you for listening, and I apologize for not leaving more time for the Q&A, but I hope this was an interesting discussion, and please follow along on social media and, throughout the month of October, because I'll be doing a lot more conversations about different aspects of Muslim food history. Thank you very much.
Wow, there's so many aha moments that I had. Like Makai, I grew up in India, so I never knew Makai had, it could be traced back to Makkah. Thank you so much, Hassam. I know there are a few questions, but we want to be mindful of everybody's time. So there's 2 minutes. If there's any one question that we can address, please ask away. There was someone who was asking for the slides, but I believe this entire presentation will be available on the WPL YouTube channel, so you can access it from there. There was someone who said they were hungry. I see a lot of reactions going up, and they were going up throughout the presentation. Where can I buy halal lard to make pie crust? I don't know if and Hassam, if you could send us later the links to your later presentations on, say, coffee, like a more deep dive into coffee. Maybe we can, post it on the CMW social media. We'd love to, promote that as well, because I'd like to attend that. And yes, I think we're almost at time. So, and we don't see any more questions. Oh, do you post your upcoming talks on social media?
Yes, I do. So on Twitter, my name is, or my handle is Hassam M_. So my first name and then M, my last name, the initial of my last name and underscore. And on Instagram, it's hassam.history. So if you follow along there, you should be able to see events and other things as they come up.
So thank you so much. This has been an amazing session. I know for a fact that I learned a lot, especially the infographic on the doner. That is really interesting for me, and I'm sure everybody has their own takeaways from this. You have some question by Javed. Is there a book that talks more about the Islamic food history?
They're more like dense academic works and things like that. This is an emerging field. So hopefully we'll have more accessible writings and things that I think everybody would enjoy reading in the future. What I can do is maybe for those who had registered, we can send them out a list of the cookbooks that I mentioned, which have been translated into English. So those give you a glimpse of the food culture and ingredients and priorities and things like that at different points in history. But other than that, it's just a work in progress. So hopefully within the next few years, something to keep an eye on.
Maybe you'll write one. So there's another, Garcia says, awesome presentation, most informative and well covered, very thought-provoking. Thank you. Will you please post your Instagram and Twitter handles to Hassam? So maybe we can send that in the email to all registrants so that everybody can follow it. So I think I've covered, yeah, Javed is saying maybe you should write that book. So
I would, based on things I'm learning as I prepare for this month, I think I might actually do it. It's just an incredible topic, so fun and exciting and keeps me hungry, right? Very literally, right? So I just might.
Yeah, we look forward to that. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time is 101. So thank you so much, Hassam, and thank you to everyone who attended. And of course to Waterloo Public Library for hosting these kind of sessions. Claire, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Hassam, as well for the presentation. As Mifra said, it was so informative, and I feel like I learned so much, and it was really entertaining and interesting as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. You'll receive an email from me very soon, probably in the next couple of days. I'll send those links to everyone that Hassam shared, and again, the recording will be available on the library's YouTube channel.
All right, then. See you, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for coming. Take care. Bye.